All right, here we go. Welcome to Standing for Truth. And we are continuing our series, our End Times Theology series, with this specific video or episode being titled Pulverizing Preterism. And specifically, I am going to be debunking some errors and some arguments by Dr. Gary Demar, a well-known preterist teacher. Now, before I do get into this video, my goal is to make this one a shorter one. People that follow this channel and are up to date on the series know that I typically do put out videos that are an hour and a half, 2 hours, as I do like to be comprehensive. And so you can see here, just the other day, I put out End Times Moments 1. This was over an hour, and it'll be the longest in terms of the End Times Moments that I do. I've got a lot of sub-series, I guess you could say, in the greater series of End Times Theology. And so that one focused on the chronology of Revelation, the two-part chronology, right, where you got Revelation 1 to 11 in a near perfect chronological order, where you've got the tribulation in Revelation 6, the rapture in Revelation 7, and then the wrath, God's wrath period starting in Revelation 8. We see the millennial reign in Revelation 12, and the chronology restarts. Or no, we see the millennial reign in Revelation 11. The chronology restarts in Revelation 12, and then, just as expected, if what I am saying is true, we have the tribulation period in Revelation 13 with the mark of the beast, the one world government, the one world religion, the image of the beast. And then we have the rapture in Revelation 14 when Jesus Christ comes on a white cloud to reap the harvest of the earth. And then we have God's wrath beginning with the 7 last plagues in Revelation 15. We then have the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 19 with the millennial reign in Revelation 20. And then you get additional details, for example, that the first part chronology did not give you. We would get the great white throne judgments in Revelation 20, but we also get the battle of Gog and Magog, and then the new heavens and new earth. So that's just in a nutshell. Watch that video. It's very important. And why I'm reiterating that point is basically because a proper understanding of the two-part chronology in Revelation refutes every single one of your false eschatological positions. That includes the pre-trib rapture, the post-wrath rapture. That includes your mid-trib rapture. Obviously, I defend the post-trib pre-wrath rapture, but it also refutes partial preterism, full preterism, post-millennialism, and amil. I've also written a book right here, End Times Revealed, Dawn of the Antichrist, where you can get a very comprehensive breakdown on last days theology. It's 311 pages, and it touches on these topics in great detail. And so my recommendation, as I am mostly going to be commenting on arguments made or points made by Gary Demar in his debate with Kent Hovind. And so it's going to basically be as if I was debating Gary Demar and I'm kind of just responding to his points. But if you want really comprehensive beatdown, I guess you could say, of the partial preterism points, especially as they pertain to Daniel's 70 weeks and Daniel 9:27 specifically, as you can see here, if you go into my series, again, there's about 23 videos here. And so episode 10, episode 8, and 9 all focus on this issue. So you got 1, 2, 3, you got about 3.5 hours worth of nonstop content on the he of Daniel 9. Again, who is the he? Except in this one, I counter the critics. And so I leave no stone unturned because I understand their rescue mechanisms or how they would respond to, let's say, what I'm going to say here in this video. But there is a specific episode that deals with their possible counterpoints, I guess you could say. And then I got one titled Gaps in Daniel's 70 Weeks, proving 2 gaps. Basically 3 elements in terms of the 70 weeks. In this series, you'll find a comprehensive dismantling of dispensationalism. I've done a formal debate on the topic, as well as an open mic debate where Kent Hovind joined me for that one. You can find that in the series right here, End Times Theology with Kent Hovind. Went nearly 3 hours. And most importantly, I guess, as it pertains to the topic that I'm focusing on today, we've got, I highly recommend this informal debate I did, 2 hours and 40 minutes, very thorough, I would say, where I debated a Seventh-day Adventist. We discussed many points. Seventh-day Adventists hold to the false post-wrath position rather than pre-wrath, post-trib pre-wrath. But we also debated for a while who is the he of Daniel 9, and Jamie holds to a lot of the same talking points, or puts forth a lot of the same talking points as Gary Demar. And therefore, if you go watch that discussion, you'll see some back and forth on that. And then this episode here, I countered some of the errors put forth by fellow pre-wrather. God bless him. He's a little mixed up with his dispensationalism, unfortunately. Dr. Alan Kirshner, and I did a comprehensive response, nearly 2 hours, on Daniel 12:1 and those written in the book, and how it's those written in the book that will be delivered. Those written in the book are obviously believers, saints, followers of Christ. And so let's just get right into it. And I've got 2 separate clips here. And so we're going to start with this one. What I am going to do is mute my mic, as I am using an external one right now. And therefore, I will allow enough to play, and then I will respond in detail. Here we go. Make sure the system audio is set, and here we go.
And there's no verse, there's nothing in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27 that says anything about a gap between the 69th and the 70th year. You can read it. We're not supposed to import things into the Bible that aren't there. We need to take the Bible at its word. There's no gap between the 69th and 70th week. I'll tell you what else isn't there. There's no mention of an Antichrist there. If you read the passage, you have Messiah the Prince, you have Messiah, and you have the people of the Prince who is to come. Who says that's the Antichrist? Who says that the he in the next verse is the Antichrist? There's no mention of an Antichrist in there. One would think, if you saw the word Messiah, that you would have to see the word anti-Messiah in there. You just can't make those kinds of deductions from very, very little of what the text actually says. So, and I want to go back to the 70 weeks of years thing and the gap, because that's an extremely important part of the prophecy. How does Daniel 9 begin? Do you remember what happens at the beginning of Daniel 9? Daniel is reading what we would call today the book of Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11, it states how long the captivity is. Why is Daniel in captivity? Because of a violation all the way back to the Levitical laws, and they're going to put the land of Israel to rest for 70 years. And so they're going to be deported. They're the northern tribes first, and then finally the southern tribes, and they're going to be deported. They're going to be in captivity for 70 years. Here's the question. What if God, at the end of the 69th year, without telling the Jews, that he just decided, well, there's just going to be a gap there. We're just going to put a gap between the 69th and 70th year. And so the people of Israel just waiting that the 70th year is going to come. And it came, and they're still in captivity. And then they thought, well, maybe we miscalculate. So they wait another year and another year and another year. So they finally get one of the prophets, and the prophet says to the prophet, communicate with God and see why we're still here. Oh, don't worry. What I did is I put a parenthesis in there. I put a gap in time. You're still only in captivity for 70 years, but we're not counting the parenthesis. So I believe that the 70 years of captivity is the anchor point for the 70 weeks of years. That it's the same relationship. No gap in the captivity, no gap in the 70 weeks of years. There's nothing in the text that says there's a gap. You have to import that into the text. There's nothing in the text that said this is the Antichrist. I believe all those references are to Jesus Christ. Jesus is the one who ends up bringing judgment upon Jerusalem, which took place in Matthew chapter 24. This isn't the Antichrist that's doing this. What's the definition of Antichrist? I always ask people, what is the biblical definition for Antichrist? What is the biblical definition for Antichrist? Someone who denies that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. All right? Is this a world leader? No. How many Antichrists are there? Were there, actually? There were many of them. 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. There were many Antichrists. The only time the word Antichrist is used in the Bible is in 1 John and 2 John. That's it. And the definition is very clear, repeated a couple of times. Someone who denies that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. That's the biblical definition of Antichrist. And yet today's Antichrist is a composite Antichrist. They take the phrase Antichrist and they say, well, it's the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2. It's the beast. It's actually, there are two beasts in Revelation chapter 13. And it's the little horn. You pick all the bad guys you can find in the Bible and they say that's the Antichrist. But it doesn't fit the definition. I'm in the Presbyterian Church in America, which is a conservative Bible-believing denomination. And we subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And in the Westminster Confession of Faith, it had a definition of Antichrist. And the Antichrist was supposed to be the papacy. In fact, that was a very popular view for many, many years, that the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, was the papacy. And it was written into a creedal and confessional material. They eventually took it out. They weren't saying that the Roman Catholic Church was the true church. They just said it doesn't fit the definition of Antichrist. I've got a book here. Christopher Hill, Antichrist in 17th Century England. Look at this book. This is a book about the Antichrist. People thought the Antichrist was in.
Okay, let's stop it there and cover his points quickly, as the main point that I want to cover is a challenge he puts forth on the Antichrist and the covenant. So real quick, he says, he points out you have the 70-year Babylonian captivity, and it's not until the 70 years is over, basically it's all consecutive, there's no gaps, and that is essentially when the Israelites can make it back into the promised land. And he says the 70 years of Babylonian captivity is essentially the anchor point to the 70 weeks of Daniel. And he says there's a similar relationship. Well, where Gary DeMar goes wrong, unfortunately, is there is a relationship there. It is an anchor point in a sense. But remember, it was the Israelites that were in captivity for 70 years. And that 70 years ended with them making it back into the promised land, essentially. The end of the 70 weeks of Daniel ends in a similar fashion, but it ends how? It ends with the millennial kingdom, when all of spiritual Israel shall inherit the land. And that is after the 7-year period. That is after the times of the Gentiles, which essentially starts at the midpoint of the week, at the abomination of desolation, right? And it talks about how Jerusalem will be trodden down underfoot of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles has been fulfilled, essentially. And that 3.5-year period, the 42 months where the Antichrist continues in power, that culminates with the millennial reign of Jesus Christ, when every single believer of all time is raised to rule and reign with Christ, literally. And so that is the relationship to the 70 years of Babylonian captivity and the 70 weeks that we read about in Daniel 9:24-27. But what I want to put out or put forth is the fact that people like Gary DeMar and preterists that I've engaged with, they'll say, there's no gaps. There's no justification for gaps. It's exactly the same as the 70 years. It's all consecutive. Okay, well, firstly, we're not in the millennial reign yet. And when you understand the 2-part chronology of the book of Revelation, there's no way that we have lived in a time, or there has been a time historically where we've seen, hail and fire being cast upon the earth, where we've seen these events, these judgments, especially with the trumpets and the vials. Nor have we seen, and this is where it's going to get into basically the preterist arguments within Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. Okay, so nonetheless, the difference between the 70 years of Babylonian captivity and the 70 weeks is the fact that the 70 weeks are actually broken up for us. This is what the Bible does for us. This isn't us making anything up. This is the Bible actually breaking up the weeks for us, okay? Because we have 7 weeks, then 62 weeks, and then with only 69 weeks accounted for, we have 1 week period that's left. Okay, so it's the Bible that's breaking up the 70 weeks into 3 elements. The Bible did not break up the 70 years of Babylonian captivity, but the Bible did break up the 70 weeks into 3 elements, or one could say 3 components, where you've got that 7-week period, you've got that 62-week component, and then the final week, Daniel's 70th week. But these preterists, both partial and full, and Gary DeMar would consider himself, I believe, a partial preterist, as he would not say that we're in the new heavens and new earth, which is what full preterists would say, which is absolutely unreal that they could say such a thing. Okay. But these partial preterists specifically, they would argue that the first 3.5 years of the 70th week is in the ministry of Jesus Christ, meaning that Jesus had a ministry of 3.5 years. And that ministry accomplished the first half of Daniel's 70th week. But this is wrong, because remember, it was at the end of the 69th week that Jesus was cut off. So that doesn't work. The 70th week hadn't even begun when Messiah was cut off. So even if you were to say that there's no gap from the 69th and 70th weeks, as Gary DeMar would say, as he's basically pointing out that there's no justification for a gap or 2 gaps, since we do have 7 weeks, a gap, 62 weeks, and a gap, because the Bible breaks that up for us. 3 elements, 3 components. But even for sake of argument, if you were to say that there was no gap from the 69th and 70th weeks, the 70th week would start when Jesus is cut off, Messiah is cut off. Not for himself, but for us, for the world, for you and me, which is an amazing prophecy about his substitutionary atonement, right? Because we know Israel at the time, they were looking to the Messiah as being one who would bring them back into their former glory or triumph. But he was actually cut off for the sins of the world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And so the problem here with your partial preterists is that, even for sake of argument, if there was no gap, you're still going to have to start the 70th week with Jesus cut off. That means you can't put his ministry into Daniel's 70th week. Another thing is, if you have a 1-week period, so 7 years, and basically Jesus is cut off after his ministry, 3.5 years into it, what happened in the second half, in terms of what happened at the end of the 3.5 years, at the end of the week? One could say, they make things up, like Stephen was stoned, or whatever they put forth is not biblical. Show me that in the Bible. How does that make any sense? And what I am going to demonstrate here, as you are going to see, is biblical. It also fits with history, because if we were to go to Revelation 12 and 13, for example, it makes it absolutely clear that we have an end time 7-year period. We have 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 1,290 days, 42 months, times, and the dividing of times, times, and half a times. I mean, it all equals 3.5 years, because it's all a subset of the 7 years. That's why it's all broken up into 3.5-year periods. And it's just a slap in the face of your historicists that want to say that, these aren't days, these are years. Well, wait a minute. They're correlated with months, with days, with years. 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. It's like God put that there on purpose to tell the historicists, no, these are literal days. You can't take the 1,260 days and try and say that they are years. Okay, all of these numbers amount to 7 years. And there's a couple more points I want to make there. But before I do, Gary DeMar said that the definition of Antichrist, right? He that denieth that Jesus is the Christ, he is Antichrist. That denieth the Son. And so, with the future Antichrist, he claims to be God. I mean, he steps foot into the temple. He claims to be God. He's going to be worshipped as God. He's going to set up an image. Okay, so he is one. He is a one world leader who denies that Jesus is the Christ. And even worse, he will claim to be God in the flesh. He sitteth in the temple as God, capital G. We know he's not actually God, but from the world's vantage point, they will claim he is God. And we know that the man of sin, he is not, because he is killed with a deadly wound to his head. And out of the bottomless pit essentially comes the spirit of Antichrist. He's taken over. It's a false resurrection. The world worships after him. Okay. But what I really want to get into here is this notion that there's no Antichrist at all in Daniel 9, or here's what we have to do. If we're looking to Daniel 9, we have to look at the context, not just Daniel 9. We got to look to Daniel 7, Daniel 8. We got to look to Daniel 11, 12. We got to look at it all as a whole. Okay. And so that's what I want to do here. Now, here's just recapping a couple of the points I made. We read that there will be 7 weeks and then 62 weeks, right? If you notice this, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins. And I go through this. I got a whole section in my book on this, on the topic of Daniel 70 weeks. So notice, finishing the transgression, making an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, one thing I want to point out real quick before I move on is that your preterists especially, is they fail to understand or even just consider what's called shadow fulfillment and a future more dramatic fulfillment. Okay, so dual and triple prophecy fulfillments, basically, where you have an immediate fulfillment in the context of that day, let's say, but then you have a future more dramatic fulfillment. And I've done whole videos on this. I've got a whole section on it in my book. One quick example is in Genesis, when Abraham is offering his son up on the altar, and God says he'll provide himself a lamb, okay, instead. At that time, what was sacrificed wasn't a lamb, so it wasn't an exact fulfillment. There was an immediate partial fulfillment with the ram. It was a ram that was offered up. But we understand that when God says he will provide himself a lamb, well, we know that in the future is Jesus Christ, the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And so in the future, when Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, that was the lamb slain before the foundation. That was God manifest in the flesh. Okay, giving himself a sacrifice for the world. And so you have an immediate partial fulfillment, but the full, more dramatic fulfillment is in the future with the literal lamb, Jesus Christ, that was slain for the sins of the world. And so when you look to these things, when Jesus died on the cross, was buried, and rose again, his death, burial, and resurrection, well, if you notice what the 70 weeks will accomplish, we do have a shadow fulfillment, finishing the transgression, making an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, telling me that there's still some prophecy, some loose ends that need to be, that need to take place, essentially, in order that it can all be sealed. Okay. And to anoint the most holy. Well, here's where the partial preterists go right, but then they're wrong at the same time, because one could say Jesus Christ was anointed at his baptism. Jesus Christ brought in everlasting righteousness in the sense that when I believed, right, when I believed and trusted on Jesus Christ for salvation, okay, but to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. Well, because I have believed, I've been passed from death unto life. I'm justified. I'm regenerated, as in I'm born again spiritually. I'm being sanctified, and I'm predestined for glorification, which is final sanctification, where we get our glorified bodies, where there will literally be no more sin. The only reason we sin right now is because we still have this unregenerate flesh. We await the salvation or the redemption of our bodies. That is future, right? That is why it is appropriate to say we are saved, we're being saved, we will be saved, because we are saved in the sense that when we believed, we were justified. In a moment being justified, we have peace through faith, okay, in Jesus Christ. We are born again. We are passed from death unto life. We are in the life now. We're being sanctified. Okay, so we are saved. We're being saved, and we will be saved because we await for what? Final sanctification or glorification, the redemption of our bodies. Okay, so yes, he brought in everlasting righteousness, because when I believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, I am saved eternally. Eternal literally means life that never ends. You've been passed from death unto life. There's no condemnation, future tense, for the believer. He's made a reconciliation for iniquity because of his death, burial, and resurrection on the cross. Okay, so one could even say he's ruling and reigning in our hearts right now. Jesus Christ is ruling and reigning in the hearts of believers right now. But is he actually literally and physically ruling and reigning on this earth with a rod of iron? Is there a literal end to sin, as in we no longer sin? No, that is future. That's why the millennial reign, which, remember, the Israelites came back to the promised land after 70 years of Babylonian captivity. And the 70 weeks will end with every single believer of every single generation of all time. And in the Old Testament, your believers, those that believed on the Lord, those that called upon the name of the Lord in the Old Testament saints looking to the cross, us looking back to the cross, those believers from the literal 12 tribes of Israel, they're going to be raised. They're going to inherit the land. So remember, the 70 years end with a return to the promised land. The 70 weeks end with the millennial reign, where we are literally, every single believer is literally ruling and reigning with Jesus Christ on this earth. All of spiritual Israel shall be saved. Once the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, when we compare Luke and Revelation and Romans 11, we understand that that's the 3.5 years or 42 months, which starts at the abomination of desolation when Jerusalem is trodden down underfoot. That's the correlation. That is the relationship. That's the anchor point that Gary Demar was talking about. And that's where he goes wrong. And so, yes, all of these things were fulfilled in terms of its shadow fulfillment, but its future, more dramatic fulfillment, the literal fulfillment, when these things are fulfilled in its fullness, that'll be at the millennial reign when Jesus is literally anointed, a triple anointing. Okay. And just like priests were anointed with oil, priests and kings in the Old Testament, Jesus will literally be anointed in the millennial reign. There will literally be an end to sin, because guess what? We're ruling and reigning with Jesus Christ in an everlasting kingdom that will never end. Okay, yes, you have the millennial reign, the 1,000 years. Once that is up, then eventually you have the new heavens and new earth. But nonetheless, we are in our glorified bodies everlastingly. We will never sin again. Okay. And so that is important to understand that, yes, in a sense, these were fulfilled, and they will be fulfilled again, or in their fullness, or in a more dramatic sense. Okay. So it's not one or the other. It's both. It's both. Just like Daniel 8 is both Antiochus Epiphanes and the future Antichrist. Just like Daniel 11 is both Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist, because you have partial fulfillments, but the full fulfillment, the more dramatic fulfillment, is not until the end. Okay. And we see this all throughout scriptures. That's why you have Babylon being destroyed in the Old Testament before Jesus Christ came to this earth. But then you also have Revelation talking about a future Babylon that will be destroyed. And that's why when you read about the destruction of Babylon in Jeremiah, all of those details did not occur back then, because some will be fulfilled in the future. And the same thing goes with Daniel 8 and 11, right? In their entirety, they will be fulfilled. All those loose ends, it will all be fulfilled. Okay, so where is the gap? Well, notice this. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So we have what? 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. So it is the Bible, it is God that is breaking these up for us. We see two components there. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. We know that when the street and the wall were being built, there was strife, there was conflict. Ezra and Nehemiah, I believe, is where you can see these things. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, 62 weeks. Okay, so there's your two components. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. There's an amazing prophecy of the substitutionary atonement. And the people of the Prince, this is going to be important for later, okay? And the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. So going to the gap, there's a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. There's also a gap between the 7th week and the 8th week as well. There are 7 weeks, then a gap. And there are 62 weeks, then another gap, and then the 70th week. You have 3 components. We're not making stuff up. So the challenge is kind of ridiculous from the preterists, since the gaps are there for us. And as you can see here, it was at the end of the 69th week that Jesus Christ was cut off, Messiah. So the 70th week hadn't even begun yet when Messiah was cut off. And so, no, you can't put the ministry of Jesus Christ, a 3.5-year period, in that 70th week. And I would say the gap is necessary. So notice this, the gap is necessary. So firstly, you don't want to just have one 69-week period. No, there's a gap between the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks. It's not just 69 weeks. There's a gap. The gap is necessary. And you'll see these guys try and cook the books, where they'll look to when, Jesus Christ was crucified. We basically know that day. They'll work it back to when, these things took place. And you'll notice that the math doesn't work out perfectly. There's a lot of cooking the books. There's a lot of twisting. And the reason why that is, and the reason why there's a lot of in-house debate on that, is because there's a gap. And when you recognize the gap, you understand, okay, this makes sense. And the gap is necessary in order that they don't know exactly when Christ would come and die on the cross for our sins, because this would be giving them far too much information, which makes it a what? Makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy. The point of the verse is to let them know and us that these things are going to happen. There are going to be 70 important weeks of prophecy that these specific significant elements will happen. What is the 7 weeks? People often ask me, what is the 7 weeks then? If you got 3 components? Well, getting the temple, wall, and street built. That would take some time, right? To do those things. So 7 times 7, you have 49 years. The 7 weeks end with everything being built. Then you have a little bit of a gap. And then the 62 weeks ends with Messiah being cut off, Jesus Christ dying. And so it fits nicely. What I want to do is point out how this verse over here, where it talks about the people of the prince that shall come, and then he shall confirm the covenant for 1 week. Well, why that's important is because what we read here in terms of that final week and in terms of the shadow fulfillment is we have, starting in 66 AD, we know this from history, it's well-known history, we have this 7-year Jewish-Roman war. That right in the middle of the war, 3.5 years in, we have the temple being destroyed in 70 AD. So 66 AD, then 3.5 years in 70 AD, the commander Titus and his Roman army come in, right? The people of the prince that shall come. So it's the people of the prince that are destroying the temple, destroying the city. And this happens right in the middle of the war, because the war doesn't end in 70 AD. It actually continues to 73 AD. So you have this 7-year war, and right in the middle of the war, Commander Titus and his Roman army come in. The Roman army specifically are the ones that destroy the temple for the second time. And this all fits perfectly with what we're talking about. This also fits the antecedent, okay? Because you'll notice if go to the verse in question. Actually, before I go to this, what I want to do is allow Gary Demar here to finish his points, and then we're really going to hammer the Antichrist objection, that apparently the Antichrist is not here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is stop the screen share again, share system audio, mute. Okay, so we're going to allow him to finish his points, and then I'm going to get to the main part here that I wanted to address in terms of the Antichrist in Daniel 9. So here we go, guys.
Only place in Scripture where there's a gap in time, and yet none is indicated. There isn't a gap indicated anywhere in the text. So there's no Antichrist mentioned. And that's something you really have to put into the text. You have to take concepts from the New Testament and pour it into that passage. It doesn't say anything about an Antichrist. The Antichrist doesn't make covenants. Who makes covenants? Who makes covenants? God makes covenants. God, who made covenants with the many? Matthew chapter 26, 28. There are other places too. Matthew 26, 28. Let's see. Verse 26. And while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took a cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is to be shed on behalf of many for forgiveness of sin.
Okay. So again, real quick, this is from a debate between Gary DeMar and Kent Hovind. This is where he basically makes the argument that, you know, there's nowhere where an Antichrist makes a covenant. The Antichrist is nowhere to be found in Daniel 9 and so on and so forth. So here is where I'm going to be very comprehensive on this point. So let's go start at where we would look at the antecedent. And so we have Messiah the Prince, and then after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, and not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he, so here's the debate right here. Who is the he of Daniel 9:27? And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Well, the wrong interpretation made by Gary DeMar here is to say that verse 27 of Daniel 9 is talking about Jesus and not the Antichrist or Commander Titus in terms of its 70 AD fulfillment. They'll say that it's Jesus or the Messiah, going back to the Messiah who's cut off, who is the one acting. Okay. The easiest way to disprove this is by pointing out the fact that the last singular noun mentioned is what? Prince. People of the prince. Messiah the prince shall be 7 weeks. But once you go down here, you see what? The people of the prince that shall come. And so your immediate antecedent. See, if I were to say, you know what? He is an editor for Standing for Truth Ministries. You'd say, who is he? Who are you talking about? But if I said, you know, Matt helps me put out content for Standing for Truth Ministries. He is an editor for the team. Now you know, okay, it's talking about Matt. He is good at baseball. Well, who? You know, John likes baseball. He is good at baseball. Now you understand who I'm talking about. And so the last singular noun, right, because the pronoun has an antecedent. This is pretty basic. And so when we see a he, we understand it is referring to a person. And here in this passage, that person that we just read about is the prince that shall come. And we understand how it fits perfectly with history, since I just went over it, that in terms of its 70 AD fulfillment is Commander Titus, the Roman prince, whose army destroyed the temple and the city in 70 AD. And so it requires a lot of stretching and twisting to try and say that this is Jesus, when this fits so perfectly, firstly, just with basic grammar, but also with history. And they'll say, well, you know, that the people of the prince, those that would say it's Jesus would say that, you know, it's the people of the prince, believers, or they'll say people of the prince, you know, the Jews at the time, because of their rejection of the Messiah, it's their doing. It's their fault, basically, that the temple or the city was destroyed. The people of the prince are believers. People of God are believers, saints, okay? But the major interpretation I've heard from the preterists is saying, well, you know, the Roman army is the one that destroyed the temple, but it was God, basically, or the city. God was basically using them as an instrument. Yes, you can say that. God was using the Roman army as an instrument to carry out his judgment because of the rejection of the Messiah. The Jews rejected the Messiah. But you can't actually say that they are the people of the prince. The people of the prince if we're talking about God's people, would not be the Roman army. You could say that he uses them as an instrument, like in Zechariah 14, God says, I will bring the nations against Jerusalem for battle to carry out his will, right? But that doesn't literally mean that they are the people of God. Okay, so that doesn't make any sense. And another argument that they'll try and say, well, it can't be the immediate antecedent. It can't be the antecedent because it's people of the prince, right? But I've pointed out in past debates, past videos, that the object of a preposition can still be the antecedent of a subject pronoun. And so there's not some real strict rule of grammar there. And so it's a very weak case that the full and partial preterists have in terms of who the he is in Daniel 9:27. But what is going to truly answer this question is the context. Context is key. We often hear in terms of, sound and consistent biblical hermeneutics is what? Context, context, context. So firstly, the prince is the immediate antecedent, as in the people of the prince that shall come. Okay. And it also doesn't make any sense to say or argue that the antecedent can't be the prince of the people, since the verse mentions people rather than just prince. Okay. Because just because it is an object of a preposition doesn't in any way stop it from being the antecedent. They're rescue devices. But you know what? Let's allow the resolution to have to do with the context. Is the Antichrist being mentioned anywhere? Okay, so let's look at all the surrounding verses. And firstly, Gary Demar, he mentioned how the Antichrist doesn't make a covenant. Now, a covenant just means agreement, and we're going to get into that in a second. But I want to point this out in Daniel 8. In terms of its immediate fulfillment, we understand, I've got a whole section on this in my book, Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Antiochus Epiphanes. But what a lot of preterists don't understand is there's a lot of parallels. Just like there's your shadow fulfillments and also, your more future dramatic fulfillments. There's parallels, and we see parallels all throughout the scripture. And so Daniel 8, you have a lot of parallels in the sense that this, in its immediate context, in this time period, you had Antiochus Epiphanes, the Grecian leader, the Grecian king, who came in, set up a Zeus statue. Okay. And, you can even find gold coins of Antiochus Epiphanes where, his face is on it. It says God manifest. So there's parallels there to the future Antichrist, because guess what? You have Jesus also speaking about an abomination of desolation, Matthew 24. But wait a minute, there is an abomination of desolation during this time period as well with the Grecian Empire and Antiochus Epiphanes. And so you have parallels, you have shadows, all of these things to the main event in the future, because not only does Jesus talk about an abomination of desolation, and so your preterists would have to admit that there's some kind of shadow as well, since if they want to say this is the abomination of desolation, which it was an abomination of desolation, and Antiochus Epiphanes was a type of Antichrist or an Antichrist during this time period, especially since, you got coins calling him God manifest. And so you have Jesus talking about an abomination of desolation, Matthew 24. And then in Revelation 13, we have a one world leader, a false prophet who's convincing people to worship this leader, and then also a great image that's set up. And if people don't worship this image, they're going to be killed. Where did that happen? In 70 AD, and then also here before the time of Christ with Antiochus Epiphanes. It didn't happen. There is an image, but that image couldn't talk, couldn't both speak and talk, and whoever didn't worship it would be killed worldwide. No, because that is talking about the future Antichrist, which we read about in Revelation. So yes, a statue of Zeus was set up in the temple. There was an abomination of desolation there. There is a kind of abomination of desolation in 70 AD with Commander Titus, since his army destroyed the temple, but I don't think there's any historical accounts of him setting up anything. And then in the future, we read in Revelation, we also read Jesus Christ talking about Matthew 24, where there's going to be another leader and another image that's set up, except this time it's an image that can speak. There's also a mark associated with it that if you don't take this mark, you're going to be killed. You can't buy or sell. None of these things happen because although there's partial fulfillments, or all of this, happened in a more local minor scale, in the end times is going to happen in more of a grander scale. The main event, one could say, because a lot of what happened during this time period were localized, right? The world of that time. Where in the end times, and we read about it in Revelation, it's worldwide in scope rather than localized. But it also comprises things that back in these days, back during the Roman Empire, technology-wise, these things weren't capable. I mean, possible. There is no way, technologically speaking, where you could have an image that could actually speak. But today we could see that, right? You got movies, you got teleprompters, you've got holograms. I mean, for example, you're listening to me speak. I'm an image on a screen. I'm not the abomination of desolation, but you can see how that's possible. All throughout history, people would have wondered, how are some of these things possible? How could you have in Revelation, we have two witnesses dying, lying in the streets of Jerusalem, and everybody can see their bodies? Well, today we can understand how that's possible because of internet, streaming, TV, so on and so forth, right? Or, how would it ever be possible to institute a worldwide mark where people who don't take that mark, they can't buy or sell. And if they can't buy or sell, they'll be killed. Or if they refuse to worship the beast, they'll be killed. Or the image of the beast, which can talk. All of these things today, we understand how that's possible. Okay. So that's why you have to understand that, yes, although Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, that's where a lot of people, futurists, go wrong. They want to say, no, Daniel 8 has nothing to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel 11 has nothing to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, yes, it does. But it also has to do with the Antichrist in the future. It's happened before on a minor scale, and it is going to happen again on a much larger scale in a more dramatic sense. And you have to be living under a rock to not see where this world is heading. Even non-Christians write books. Upstairs in my library, I got a ton of books talking about where this world is heading with all the evidence pointing towards a one world government, a one world religion, a one world currency, the Great Reset, all of these things. That is what? Predicted throughout the scriptures, in Daniel, in Revelation. We see that this is exactly where we're heading. I mean, are these preterists just going to say this is all coincidental? No, it's not a coincidence, my friend. The world works in cycles. God works in cycles. There's prophetic cycles. There's nothing new under the sun. Okay, so there's been an abomination of desolation in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and it's going to happen again. This is just how the world works. Get over it. It's not that difficult to understand, okay? So let's see. Who's the one taking away the daily sacrifice? So notice over here, and he shall confirm the covenant. And he shall confirm the covenant. Well, firstly, the last singular noun mentioned is the people of the prince. So that's what the he points to. They're going to say, no, bring it back to the Messiah, or somehow they'll try and twist it and even say that prince there is Jesus, which doesn't work. Doesn't match up to known history with the 7-year Jewish-Roman war, which is a fact, okay? And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. Okay. Well, firstly, I find it hilarious that in Revelation, we see that Antichrist continues in power for 42 months, which is 3.5 years, which is right in the middle of a 7-year period, because you have 1260, 1290, 3.5 years, right? Times and half a times. And then you've got the 42 months. So it's all in basically units of 3.5 years. And so this is for 42 months. So in the middle of a 7-year period at the abomination of desolation. But yet, even with its perfect correlation, your preterists basically want to say, no, this is still talking about Jesus. It really is just grasping at straws. So let's have a look then. Who is the one taking away the sacrifice? We don't just look here, context. Daniel 8, 7, 11, 12. Let's get it all. Well, notice this. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. Interesting. Which waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. Keep reading. Notice this. Yea, he, referring back to the little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes at the time, future Antichrist. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by who? By him. By him, the daily sacrifice was taken away. By Jesus? No. By the little horn, who is not Jesus. You see how simple this is? It goes Daniel 8, Daniel 9. And so if you've read the entire book of Daniel, although you can split the book in the middle essentially and get a two-part chronology similar to Revelation, you would understand by the time you get to Daniel 9:27, you would understand that the one taking away the sacrifice, because even if it was Jesus, he did not, did the sacrifices stop in 33 AD? No. They still continued sacrifices until 70 AD. Well, they were supposed to stop. They want their cake and eat it too. Now, Jesus, because of his death, burial, and resurrection, because of his finished work on the cross, there's no need for animal sacrifices. Animal sacrifices never saved anyways. They were a foreshadowing of the lamb, the one sacrifice that would take the sins of the world, take away the sins of the world, okay? So no, even in a third rebuilt temple, again, the world works in cycles. There was the first temple, that was destroyed. Then there was a second temple that was destroyed. And even when that temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that wasn't a temple of God, because they're sacrificing animals after Jesus had already died and rose again. Those animal sacrifices were wicked. They weren't of God. That temple wasn't of God, and it was destroyed. And the third temple's not going to be a temple of God either. But the world works in cycles. There's no reason to believe, there's already lots of talk about it now, that there will be a third temple. It's not that far-fetched, okay? And so he shall make it desolate. Notice this. And by him, the daily sacrifice was taken away. This is pretty basic, guys. It's not Jesus. It's the Antichrist. Notice this, Daniel 7. Now remember, in Daniel 7, we have a different little horn coming out of a different kingdom than in Daniel 8. Very interesting, right? I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn. In this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and mouth speaking great things. Correlates perfectly with Revelation 13, because you have shadows, partial fulfillments. We also have the literal, more dramatic fulfillments in the future. We read about that in Revelation. That's why we have to go to Revelation to fill in the details. Revelation literally means to be revealed. About speaking great things, Revelation 13. And notice, power was given unto him to continue 40 and 2 months. Because remember, with your first seals, Antichrist goes out to conquer. You got the world at war, famine and starvation. It's a ripple effect, essentially, of Antichrist going out to conquer. Because when you have a shift in power like that, typically results in a war. And so it's a general persecution of mankind, right? The woman, who represents Eve and humanity in general in Revelation 12. But once you get to the fifth seal, after the fourth seal, which is death in 1/4 of the earth, basically, you have martyrs appearing in heaven, because you have what's described in Revelation, where the unholy trinity, the dragon, the false prophet, the Antichrist, they now have their eyes set specifically. They're now focusing on believers, those that keep the commandments of Jesus Christ. And so he's continuing for 40 and 2 months. He's continuing from a prior period of time. And that period of time was your general persecution of man, your first part of the tribulation. And so right in the middle, the abomination of desolation, you have the Antichrist, who is now continuing in power for 40 and 2 months, where he is going to rule essentially from his one world government. He's given all this. But now we understand that this time is shortened for the elect's sake. And so Jesus Christ will shorten those days, come in the clouds to gather together as elect. But that's not the point of this video here. Notice this. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, matches perfectly with Daniel 7, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Where in 70 AD and where in the Grecian Empire before Jesus Christ was born, before the time of Christ, with Antiochus Epiphanes, where in the world did we have Antiochus Epiphanes or any leader at that time that had power over all kindreds, tongues, and nations? No, it didn't happen. Okay. So we have Daniel 7 again, the other little horn, the Antichrist making war with the saints. And so Antiochus Epiphanes Commander Titus, they were shadows of what's to come. The Roman Empire is basically a shadow of the end times world power and the main event still to come. Just like, Jesus was anointed at his baptism. He put an end to sins. He brought in everlasting righteousness, spiritually. He's ruling and reigning in our hearts right now spiritually. Not literally on this earth, ruling and reigning with a rod of iron. He hasn't literally been anointed in the millennial reign as king of this earth physically. He is king, again, but physically on this earth. Remember, Satan roams the earth seeking whom he may devour. He roams like a lion, okay? We battle against spiritual darkness and forces in high places, okay? So there is wickedness. You can see that in the earth clearly. And so in a similar way, Jesus came his first time during the Roman Empire, the one world power at that time. He conquered spiritually. And in the end times, with your one world beast, which is very similar to the Roman Empire in many, many ways, okay? He's going to come physically. He came in 1st century AD and conquered spiritually. He will come during the one world government in the end times. And guess what? He will conquer physically. The main event in Revelation is not localized. Antiochus Epiphanes, spoken of in Daniel 8. Jesus talks about an abomination of desolation in Matthew 24. And Revelation speaks of an abomination of desolation way off in the future, guys. Immediate fulfillments, shadow fulfillments, partial fulfillments, and a more dramatic fulfillment at a later date in the end times where all of these prophecies are completely fulfilled in their entirety. Notice Daniel 7, time and times and the dividing of time. 40 and 2, it matches up perfectly. So he's trying to say the Antichrist is the last thing I want to touch on. So he says the Antichrist doesn't make covenants, or where does it make covenants? What I want to do, since these two portions have taken a while, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to rewind a little bit and allow his point to be made again about the league. And then we're really, really going to dismantle it.
Talks about the day of vengeance. What is that day of vengeance? The day of vengeance is the destruction of Jerusalem that took place in AD 70. That's what's being described there. That's the day of vengeance. That is the day where Jesus returns in judgment and judges Jerusalem, just like he predicted he did. There is no place in the Bible where you will find a certain number of days, certain number of weeks, or a certain number of years where there is a gap in any of the numbers. Daniel, the 70 weeks of years, we're setting off the 70th week from the other 69 weeks. It would be the only place in Scripture where there's a gap in time. And yet none is indicated. There isn't a gap indicated anywhere in the text. So there's no Antichrist mentioned. And that's something you really have to put into the text. You have to take concepts from the New Testament and pour it into that passage. It doesn't say anything about an Antichrist. The Antichrist doesn't make covenants. Who makes covenants? Who makes covenants? God makes covenants. Who made covenants with the many? Matthew chapter 26, 28. There are other places too. Matthew 26, 28. Let's see. Verse 26. And while they were eating, Jesus...
Okay, so we heard his argument there. Antichrist doesn't make covenants. All right, we're going to address that. Where does the Antichrist make a covenant? I got a whole section of my book basically titled, answering a preterist challenge or something like that. And so I highly recommend reading that. Okay, notice this, a covenant. Let's go full screen on this one. What is a covenant? A covenant is essentially a deal or an agreement made with somebody. God makes covenants. I make covenants. The Antichrist can make covenants. People make agreements all the time. Doesn't mean that it's always an agreement by God. And context should tell us, what is this covenant exactly? And so Daniel 11, 21 to 24. Notice this. And again, in its immediate context, as one could say, or in terms of, the shadow fulfillment, this is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, in whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, and he shall come in what? Peaceably, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Notice the parallels with the one world leader spoken of in Revelation. Notice those parallels. And with the arms of a flood, talking when we read in the Bible oftentimes about a flood, in these types of contexts, it's referring to, you know, armies coming in for war. Shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the what? After the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. And so we have Antiochus Epiphanes, who parallels the future Antichrist, coming in peaceably. He made a league, but afterwards he works deceitfully. And notice, after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. What is a league? What is a league? Notice this definition of league, dictionary.com, not exactly a fundamentalist Christian website. A covenant. What is a league? It is a covenant or compact made between persons, parties, states. This fits like a glove. So we have Daniel 8, we have the little horn taking away the daily sacrifice. We could even go to Daniel 12, where it talks about, it says, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. These things all go together. And so these partial preterists like Gary DeMar here, they want to say it's Jesus taking away the daily sacrifice. That means they're saying that Jesus is the one setting up the abomination of desolation. Jesus doesn't set up an abomination, okay? So we have the little horn taking away the daily sacrifice, Daniel 8, which is right before Daniel 9. Daniel 11 is after Daniel 9. It's everywhere. You have to read the context. Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, 10, 11, 12. So a league is a covenant. What do we have? Antichrist making a league. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. And what happens? In Revelation, we have in the midst of the week, as Antichrist continues in power for 42 months, this one world leader, we have him with the abomination of desolation, and now focusing his power in on believers. So he's making, and he came in peaceably in order to, we understand from Revelation 12 that it is the devil, the dragon that starts the 7-year period, this end time scenario, right? He's cast out of heaven, him and his angels. Daniel 12:1 talks about Michael stands up right at the beginning of this great time of trouble, affliction, tribulation, and he and his angels fight the dragon. And this is when the devil's wrath begins at the start of the week. And so the dragon, he's present throughout the entire 7-year period since he starts it. He starts it from heaven, and on earth, we have Antichrist making a covenant. Do you see how the world works in cycles? We have prophetic cycles. God works in cycles. It all fits like a glove, especially when you understand the shadows, the parallels, the partial fulfillments versus the future, more literal fulfillments. And these dual prophecy fulfillments are all throughout scriptures. I've done whole videos on them. I got a whole section on them in my book. They can't be missed. They can't be ignored. Okay, so you have the devil starting the 7-year period in heaven when he's cast down, and then his wrath begins, and there's a general persecution of humanity or man. I did a video on just recently on the woman of Revelation 12. And then eventually, once you get to the 5th seal, you have the abomination of desolation, and you have a shift in focus to just believers. And that is where great tribulation begins. And so, no, we have Antichrist making a covenant. It's Antichrist who's taking away the daily sacrifice. Daniel 11 is a very deep and complicated chapter that comprises a dual prophecy. These verses in Daniel 11 have an application in 2nd century BC with Antiochus Epiphanes, but it also has an end times application that points to the Antichrist and his rise to power. It's in the account of Antiochus Epiphanes where it talks about how his death is without hand. Okay, now some have said, maybe he committed suicide. He was so distraught over his losses that, he committed suicide. So he was without hand because it was his own hand. I think some would even say he might have drowned himself. Okay, but there's no definitive proof of that. But it actually makes sense with the Antichrist because remember, you have parallels or you have partial fulfillments where you have generally Antiochus Epiphanes being described, but little bits and pieces that fit into the greater picture of the end time scenario, because we understand that the future Antichrist alongside the false prophet are cast into the lake of fire after the battle in Armageddon. Satan is bound for 1,000 years, and eventually he's cast in the lake of fire with death and hell after the battle in Gog of Magog. And so that makes sense, because the Antichrist is literally killed without hand, because God, Jesus Christ, throws him right into the lake of fire, essentially. Okay, so you can see these parallels, you can see these partial and shadow fulfillments. Remember, there was an abomination of desolation with Antiochus Epiphanes, a type of abomination of desolation with Titus, and she destroyed the temple. And remember, we don't see Titus necessarily making an agreement or making a league with anybody, because these prophecies don't have to fulfill every single detail, because every single detail will be fulfilled in the future. That's the point. But also a future, more dramatic abomination of desolation. Jesus talks about it in the book of Revelation in the end times with the Antichrist and the rebuilt temple, third temple. Daniel 11 is a more than sufficient answer to this commonly repeated preterist challenge. Preterists have no compelling response to why the days provided in Scripture, because guys, they'll oftentimes say, where's 7 years? Where do you see 7 years? It's like, just count up the days. 1260 is 3.5 years. 1290 is 3.5 years, but with the leap month, because the Jewish calendar, the Bible's calendar, works on 30-day months. And so eventually you're going to have to add 30 days, because rather than our years, which are 365 days, the Jewish calendar years, the Bible's calendar years, were 360 days. And so if you don't account for that discrepancy, then eventually you're going to start having summer in winter, summer in December, and winter in July. So typically what they would do to keep themselves in line with the seasons is add a leap month. And so that's why you have 1290 days in the second half, but the first half's 1260, because it's somewhere in the second half that you'd have to account for the 360-day calendar years. And so it makes sense. You have the 1290. It helps us because we understand which one is first half, which one is second half. Okay, so nonetheless, 3.5 years, 42 months, 3.5 years. And then it just spells it out for us, 3.5 years. They correlate perfectly with Daniel's 70th week being future and comprising 70 years, because right in the middle, when Antichrist continues in power for 42 months, that's where he takes away the daily sacrifice. That's where he goes against the league or the agreement that he made when he came in peacefully. Now he's going against it. Antichrist started it. And in the middle of the week is when the abomination of desolation starts, and also the great tribulation. And the devil, the dragon, is who gives the Antichrist power. And the dragon is the one from heaven who starts it. So it fits like a glove. These preterists have a very unsophisticated and sloppy form of eschatology. This is at the midpoint of the week. Daniel 9:27 tells us clearly that whoever this he is will stop the daily sacrifice. And by Jesus? No, and by him. And by him shall the daily sacrifice be taken away. Oh, no, Gary Demar. No, we don't see anywhere. And now when he says anywhere, he's just specifically talking about Daniel 9, which is very sloppy and unsophisticated biblical hermeneutics, because context is key. And therefore, we need to read Daniel 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and we'll understand clearly what's being talked about is Antiochus Epiphanes has made a league. He's a shadow of an Antichrist, or there's parallels to the Antichrist. There's nothing new under the sun. God works in cycles. There's prophetic cycles. This shouldn't be that difficult to understand. And so it's Antichrist making a league in the future. It's Antiochus Epiphanes in Daniel 8 taking away the daily sacrifice. In Daniel 12, you have the Antichrist who's setting up the abomination, because he's taking away the daily sacrifice. Whoever takes away the daily sacrifice is also setting up the abomination of desolation. Remember, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that make a desolate set up, there should be, and it goes into the 1,290 days. That makes sense, because that's the second half of the week. That is where you're going to have to add 30 days or a leap month. The daily sacrifice is, we're told in Daniel 12, and we understand from Matthew 24 and book of Revelation, specifically Revelation 13, that when the daily sacrifice is taken away, the 1,290 days begins. And we know that has to be the second half, because the first half is 1,260 days, and it's the second half where we'd have to add the 30 days anyways. You got 1,260, which is 3.5 years, 1290, which is 3.5 years. And it's right in the middle of that because they equal 7 years. It's right in the middle of that where the abomination of desolation is set up after the daily sacrifice is taken away, because the Antichrist came in and people put him into power. The Jews put him into power. That's why, again, Zechariah 14 talks about how God, it says, I will gather the nations against. Because another word for Gentile is nations. So you have the Antichrist armies, the one world government coming in, which is made up of nations, coming in, and it says Jerusalem shall be trodden underfoot for 42 months until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. The times of the Gentiles starts when Jerusalem is trodden down underfoot. And what happens after that 42 months? The millennial reign. Well, what happened in 70 AD then after the 42 months? Nothing. They make stuff up. Or they take all your trumpet and vile judgments like hail and fire being cast upon the earth, which is to be taken literally. Unless it's clearly symbolic, you're supposed to take it literally. Mountain cast into the sea, burning star falls upon the rivers, smoke and locusts out of the bottomless pit. They try and correlate these all with the Roman armies coming in and just the dust that's being kicked up from the armies, or their weapons, the battle itself. They try and symbolize everything for no reason. Basically, your preterists accuse the Bible of some very serious exaggerations. They accuse the Bible of just exaggerating everything. There's not really going to be a worldwide war and a worldwide mark and an image that can speak. And if you don't worship it, you can't buy or sell. Those things aren't literally going to happen. They localize everything. It really is a sad, sad, sad form of eschatology. So it's over. We see the numbers 1260 used, 1290 used. Antichrist continues in power for 3.5 years. This happens in the middle of the week when the sacrifice is taken away. So, it's pretty sad. But let's go here. Daniel 8, because there's so much I want to cover, and I might save some more for another video. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the what? So over here, it's calling it the transgression of desolation. So we have the transgression of desolation being correlated or relating to having a relationship to the little horn, the Antichrist. But it's called the transgression of desolation here, where elsewhere it's called the abomination of desolation, but it's the same thing. It's just like when it says covenant and it says league. It's an agreement to both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. Notice how it starts perfectly, and where it says unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Well, when's the sanctuary cleansed? Well, it's cleansed when Jesus Christ comes for the millennial reign to rule and reign. That's after Jerusalem is trodden down underfoot for 42 months. And notice this, fits like a glove. And the host to be trodden underfoot, all in Daniel. So let's compare these just to really, really give the fatal blow. Daniel 9:27, and he shall confirm the covenant. Daniel 12:11, and at the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, Daniel 9:27 says what? He shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. There shall be a 2,290 days. Lines up perfectly. The abomination of desolation is an idol being set up. Being set up indicates the idol is being set up by someone else. So no, it's not Jesus setting up the abomination. Jesus does not set up abomination. So when you actually read clearly Daniel chapter 7, 8, 11, 12, and 9, you can see that the he being talked about is clearly the Antichrist. So the grammar's on our side based on the antecedent to the pronoun. The he is referring back to the people of the prince. History confirms the fact that you had this 7-year Jewish-Roman war, 66 AD to 73 AD. Right in the middle of that war, Commander Titus sent in his army. The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the temple, right? And that's exactly what happened. This isn't all coincidence, and that's all a shadow of what's to come, because there's a lot of parallels from 70 AD to what? The end time scenario that we're referring to here. Revelation 13, the abomination of desolation, Revelation. So we have the abomination of desolation before Jesus with Antiochus Epiphanes. But wait a minute, we have Jesus talking about an abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet in Matthew 24. And then we also have an abomination of desolation being spoken of in Revelation. that they should make an image to the beast. Notice that we have an image, another image, just like with Antiochus Epiphanes, you had the image of Zeus put into the temple. But notice this one, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Preterism makes no sense. We have a triple prophecy fulfillment here, where we have an abomination of desolation in the time of the Babylonian captivity, and then also with the Grecian leader Antiochus Epiphanes with the statue of Zeus. And then we've also got kind of an abomination of desolation, you could say, with Commander Titus, although the temple was basically just destroyed and there's no evidence of an image being set up. And then we have here in the end times an actual image being set up, but this time it can speak, it has life. We understand based on modern day technology exactly what this could be. And guess what? This happens in the middle of the week, where Antichrist stands up in the holy place, takes power, full power at the midpoint. And so, you know, I don't know how this is messed. Daniel 11, more confirmation. If you think it wasn't already a fatal blow for these preterists, notice this: an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. In 927, the one who confirms the covenant is also the one who takes away the daily sacrifice, man of sin, little horn, beast, etc. The one who stops the sacrifice is also the one who sets up the abomination of desolation. It's the Antichrist, guys. It's not Jesus. Just compare these. Just compare these. Daniel 8, 9 to 11, which was right before Daniel 9. Don't just read Daniel 9. Read it all, and then you'll understand it. It's very sloppy of Gary Demar here. So Gary Demar, just like my debate with Jamie Russell, the SDA, you know what he's going to say? Oh yeah, Daniel 8, Antichrist. Daniel 7, Antichrist. Daniel 11, Antichrist. Daniel 12, Antichrist. Daniel 9, Jesus. Why? Because I said so. Zero justification. And by him, the daily sacrifice was taken away. Daniel 9:27. And he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Literally. Because guess what? The Jews did not stop the sacrifice literally in 33 AD. They continued it into 70 AD. Jesus took away the sins of the world, the need for animal sacrifices. Animal sacrifices are wicked. They're not of God. They don't save. Yes. But this is talking about a time where literally these sacrifices are going to be taken away. And Antichrist is able to come to full power because he's going to be worshipped as God. He's going to make a league, a covenant, an agreement. He's going to allow the Jews to rebuild their temple and start animal sacrifices. Remember, once the temple's built, doesn't necessarily mean the sacrifices start right away. That's why we have the 2,300 days, and those days don't start until just a little bit into the 70th week of Daniel. Daniel 8, 9 to 11. Again, by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Daniel 12, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up. The abomination of desolation is an idol being set up, guys. Where did that happen in 70 AD? Yes, the temple was destroyed. Yes, we have the 7-year Jewish-Roman war, but where's Titus making a league? Where is an abomination of desolation being set up? Where did Jesus Christ come in the clouds? When was hail and fire cast upon the earth? Where was a one world mark? Where was this image that could also speak? And if you didn't worship it, you'd be killed. Where were these locusts that came out of the bottomless pit? When did the sun and moon go dark? Where was this burning star that fell upon the rivers? When was the earth, sea, and trees all burnt up? No, these things didn't happen yet. Okay, it's a real embarrassment to say that they did. And an host was given him again. So who's against the daily sacrifice? Guys, the one who's against the daily sacrifice is the devil, who gives these guys power. And these guys that the devil gives power to are types of Antichrist, with Antiochus Epiphanes, Commander Titus, and then the actual end game Antichrist. You notice into Revelation, even with the fifth vial, you have the Antichrist who still has power. Now remember, because that time is cut short, most of his worldwide power is fought enduring God's wrath. And after the league made with him, he shall work. So he makes a league, he comes in peaceably. And just like Revelation tells us, just like Matthew 24 tells us, just like Daniel 12, Daniel tells us, He breaks that deal. He works deceitfully. Who sets up the abomination of desolation? Read it yourself. Daniel 11, Daniel 12, Daniel 8, Daniel 9. It all correlates perfectly. The one taking away the sacrifice is the one setting up the abomination. So Gary DeMar has been wrong all around. His initial points here that we addressed, over an hour ago, where he tried to make a relationship between the 70 years of Babylonian captivity and then the 70 weeks. Yeah, there's a relationship there, all right. The Israelites came back to the land. They regathered, one could say, after the 70 years was up. The 70 weeks is going to end when all of spiritual Israel, all believers of all time, are going to rule and reign with Jesus Christ in the millennial reign physically, where he's ruling with a rod of iron. That hasn't happened yet. And that's why God broke it up into three components for us: 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week. He did it. He broke it up into three elements because that has to be the case, since after the 69 weeks, Jesus Christ, Messiah, is cut off. And we still have a ways away down the road until the millennial reign. And there's going to be events leading up to the millennial reign, okay? And then he tried to say that the definition of Antichrist doesn't fit with the Antichrist and Antiochus. Antiochus Epiphanes was referred to as God manifest. The Antichrist in the future is going to step into the temple, claim to be God. He's going to be against the Most High. People are going to worship him as the Jews are going to think he's the Messiah. Everybody's going to think he's the savior of the world. He's going to come in peaceably. He's going to claim to be God. You think he's accepting Christ? He's saved? No, he denies that Jesus is the Christ. As a matter of fact, he's claiming to be Christ. Fits perfectly with the Antichrist. I mean, is this the best that they got? And so those were his first points. Didn't prove anything there. And then he says, oh, Antichrist is nowhere to be found. Antichrist is everywhere to be found. Like, it's the opposite of what he's saying. Oh, Antichrist is nowhere to be found. He's everywhere. And then he says, oh, where does the Antichrist make a covenant? In the same place where people say, oh, where's the abomination of desolation mentioned? In throughout Daniel. And it's like Daniel 8 talks about the transgression of desolation. It's everywhere. Same words, different words, same thing. Just like league and covenant, different words, same thing. A league literally means a covenant. Oh, where does the Antichrist make a covenant? This is him making a covenant in Daniel 11. This is Jesus Christ. Ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, because you had an abomination of desolation with Antiochus Epiphanes before Jesus. And then you have the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And then you have the future abomination of desolation. But notice this: once the abomination of desolation happens, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. So think about it. If preterism trash was true, so you have great tribulation, but here it says, except those days should be shortened, no flesh should be saved. And we understand this is talking about physical salvation, because the persecution is going to be so harsh and so worldwide and so directed on believers that if those days were not shortened, no flesh would be saved. And that's why it says, for the elect, referring to believers, those days shall be shortened. And it talks about how he that endureth to the end, the same shall be saved. The end of what? The end of the days just spoken about, which is the days of the great tribulation, because that's when Jesus Christ comes in the clouds to gather together his elect. When did this all happen in 70 AD? It didn't. Whenever this so-called abomination of desolation happened in 70 AD, that means right after that, there was great tribulation, worse than any time on the planet, worse than World War II, worse than World War I, worse than things going on in the Dark Ages, worse than, everything leading up to the flood, when every thought in the mind of man was wicked. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't fit. Yet the 7-year Jewish-Roman War in that localized region, it was a big thing. But people outside of that region, China, India, wherever, it wasn't even probably on their radar. You might have had Jews fleeing there and talking about it and stuff, but it was basically worldwide. It was just a big nothing burger. But in that localized region, yeah, it was big. But this tribulation in the end times, it's world. No one's going to escape it. No one's going to escape it. And especially once you get to the fifth seal, where you have the martyrs appearing in heaven, and you have this worldwide mark instituted, and this image that can speak that's alive, essentially, you know, like a hologram or some kind of digital image, where the image of Zeus didn't speak, wasn't alive. And so this is where I've got so I've done whole shows, so you can just see dual prophecy fulfillment. I got slide after slide, and I just don't have time for that right now. But you know what? Although I'm out of energy, I wanted to touch on this one thing over here, and then I'll feel like this was complete. And so what I find very curious is in Revelation 12, again, I explained how this is not Israel. This is not the Virgin Mary. This is talking about Eve, the mother of all living, right? There's enmity between Eve and the serpent. There's enmity between the seed of the woman and the serpent, because the serpent hates man. The serpent hates humanity. And that's why we have so much murder and war and filth and perversion on this planet. There's a general persecution of man, and there's a directed persecution on believers in the Great Tribulation, especially, and throughout time, of course. Okay. The devil especially hates believers, one could say. But notice this. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. So 3.5 years from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman. Okay, which I think is pretty clearly referring to, you know, armies and war, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But notice this, Daniel 9, what does it say? Well, shall come and destroy the city and the sanctuary and the end. So now we're talking about the end. And the end thereof shall be with a flood. Now we know that there was the Jewish-Roman war. There's a shadow fulfillment there. But when we see the end here with a flood, notice how it correlates with the 3.5 years here, where you have, you know, armies basically war against the woman, humanity. And over here, you have a beautiful correlation where you also have in the end a flood. Okay, this war, these armies. And what do we see in the seal? The second seal, we have world at war, which continues on this ripple effect. And then we see in the fourth seal, death in 1/4 of the earth. So let's say there's 8 billion people at the time, you know, 2, 4, 6, 8, that's 2 billion people killed. But notice this, and unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. Guys, this is amazing stuff. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrificing, the oblation to cease. And for the what? Overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. Well, what happens after the war, right? Because you're going to have the Antichrist, who's essentially going to, you know, bring the world together, just as the elites and globalists have always done with claims of peace. You know, there's only one way that, you know, we're going to be able to move forward positively from this war, and to stop the war, and to stop everything that's going on in the earth in terms of inflation and pestilence and famine and all this stuff. We need to come together, you know, a one world order. And when does that happen? Well, abomination of desolation, he steps foot into the temple, becomes God, takes away the daily sacrifice. Antichrist armies come in, but this is where he's at full power, where he actually is able to persecute, direct persecution on what? Christians. But this is after, this is the abomination of desolation after the war. And so what does it say? And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. Abomination of desolation correlates perfectly. Daniel 11. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. So you have the war. Antichrist goes out to conquer. First seal, second seal, world at war. Third seal, you got famine, starvation, inflation. Fourth seal, you've got death in 1/4 of the earth, billions of people killed. And then you have the fifth seal, martyrs appearing in heaven. This is where we get the details in Revelation 13 pertaining to the image, pertaining to the one world currency. It's the abomination of desolation where he works deceitfully. He made a league prior, 3.5 years, and now in the midst of the week, he's working deceitfully. He's breaking that agreement. He's going against that agreement. And that's where in Matthew 24, it says, God it says there's wrath upon this people, referring to the Jewish nation, because you have second person plural pronouns referring to believers, ye, your, with Christians. You will be delivered up for my name's sake. But with the Jewish nation, non-Christians, you have third person plural pronouns. They, this, them. Wrath is upon this people, because guess what? The Jewish nation helped bring the Antichrist into power. They worshiped him as the Messiah. He claimed to be God. He denied that Jesus is the Christ. It fits the perfect definition of Antichrist. I have no idea what Gary DeMar is arguing here. Maybe he's used to debating dispensational pre-tribbers. I don't know, because these arguments aren't really that impressive. So here's the last thing I want to say as it pertains to one of their arguments, but also the nature of the second person pronouns and then the third person pronouns. This is what they like to say in Matthew 24. Now remember, Matthew 24, Luke 20, Mark 13, there are parallels. Luke 21 does have a lot to do with 70 AD. But remember, the disciples asked Jesus multiple questions. When are these things going to happen in terms of the destruction of the temple? When is your second coming? Tell us about the end. Jesus is juggling all these different questions. Okay, so to apply them only to 70 AD ignores the fact that the disciples have asked numerous questions. They've asked a question that has to do with the temple being destroyed, because Jesus just got done talking about that. Actually, we'll just go to it right here. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to shew him the building of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another. So he predicted the destruction of the temple, that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, so the disciples are coming to him privately. These are followers of Christ. These are believers, okay? I mean, Matthew 24 destroys the pre-trib rapture, but that's besides the point. This is preterism. The disciples came unto him privately, saying, so look what they're asking. Tell us, when shall these things be? Referring back to what? The destruction of the temple. And what shall be the sign of thy coming? And of the end of the world. It would be like if my kids came to me in awe and they just asked me, a bunch of questions where, one question is essentially answered in the near future, but another question would be answered in the far future. Almost if like my kids are asking me about, and I'm just going off the cuff here. They're asking me about, what about your high school days, Daddy? What was your job in college? And, how did you meet Mom? And, maybe somehow they want to make some parallels to how their life might take place. And so now I'm going to be explaining to them kind of in a nutshell events, describing events in terms of different parts of my life that are not that are separated by time. And so here we have the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, but Jesus is also going to be explaining his second coming, which is not in 70 AD. These preterists that want to put his second coming in 70 AD have to say, oh, Jesus came in the clouds to gather together his elect. Therefore, everything we see in the seals occurred up to that. But then after that, we also had like the trumpet judgments and the vial judgments. None of it makes sense. The two-part chronology refutes it. But then they also talks about the end of the world. Okay. And so what's good and why Jesus can answer this so comprehensively, where this also lines up to Revelation 6 so perfectly and beautifully, is because there are a lot of parallels. Because a lot of the things that led up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and that 7-year Jewish-Roman war, it was a localized event, but there were a ton of parallels to the future worldwide 7-year period where you actually have Antichrist going out to conquer. You have the world at war. You have this one world government that's very similar to the Roman Empire. And you have a lot of similarities in terms of just rumors of wars and wars. Rumors of wars and wars in the future is going to be amplified. Okay. So anyways, I wanted to go down here. And this is a preterist favorite passage. Okay. So they'll say, oh, but Jesus said, verily I say unto you, second person plural, talking to disciples, believers, followers of Christ, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. But wait a minute. The preterists do not like quoting the verse right before it. Context is key. So likewise, ye, again, speaking as a second person pronoun, plural pronoun, versus the third person plural pronoun. When ye, again, speaking to disciples, because they're the ones asking him. They're the ones asking him. When ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. So what is he saying? He's saying the generation that begins to see these things, his second coming is near. The end of the world is near. And verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. When you go to verse 33, it makes sense because they're asking him three different questions. His second coming, the end of the world, the destruction of the temple. He's speaking to them now, disciples, in the second person plural pronoun, indicating that you, disciples, followers of Christ, in general, when you begin to see these things, it's all going to occur in one generation. This, Jesus is refuting the historicist here, because the historicist wants to say that all these events have happened over time, where you have, Antichrist goes to, the first seal here, a couple hundred years later, this seal, abomination of desolation here, and it's just happening over hundreds of years, basically. No, Jesus is saying all of these things, once they begin to come to pass, and one could say in heaven, which we won't see, it starts with the dragon, Michael stands up. On earth, Antichrist confirming a covenant, making a league, but that's probably behind closed doors, so we won't know when that happens. We'll know for sure that we're in the tribulation period when the abomination of desolation takes place, that's for sure. But nonetheless, it makes sense because all of these events span what? 1,260 days, 1,290 days, time, times, and half a times, time, times, and a dividing of times. 42 months. Notice how these are all subsets of a 7-year period. None of them exceed 7 years. That's the point. Even the 2,300 days doesn't. So they all fit within that 7-year period. And that makes sense because once these events happen, once your first seal is broken, and in Revelation we see that more of the story is made discernible to us, all that's going to happen in that generation. And we're going to start to see these things, and we're going to know it's near, especially when the abomination of desolation hits. And the Bible tells us that the day that we wait for, how we're blessed if we make it to the 1335 days, which is shortly after the 1260. And it's at the 1260 that's the abomination of desolation. And Jesus says that those days are going to be cut short for the elect's sake, or else no flesh would be saved. Well, that makes sense. You take the 1335 and the 1260, minus them, and you get 75 days. And so those days are shortened. And guess what? That all makes sense because it's all happening in a 7-year period. As a matter of fact, leading up to the coming of the Lord Jesus at the rapture, it's actually just a little over 3.5 years because you have 1260, but it's not till 1335 that we see the rapture. And so you could say a few months max after the 1260. And so that makes sense. Yeah, when ye believers, Christians, followers of Christ, it's not Jesus's fault that disciples at that time are asking him about his second coming and the end of the world. So when he says ye, he's actually just referring to believers. They weren't called Christians at this time, but in the future, we'd understand that those are Christians. That's why in Daniel 12:1 or Daniel 7, we see saints because it's looking to the future. Daniel 12:1, it's talking about thy people. And then it correlates to written in the book. Those are found written in the book. That's talking about believers. Okay. So when he says ye, your, you, using the second person plural pronoun, he is essentially referring to believers, followers of Christ. And so when followers of Christ, when Christians, when believers, when disciples begin to see these things come to pass, his second coming is near. And guess what? That generation. So the generation being spoken about is described in verse 33 as the generation that starts to see these things come to pass. And at max, you got 3.5 years because you got 3.5 years, abomination of desolation, few months after that, the rapture, let's say, within that short time span. But then you also have roughly 1,215 days of God's wrath period. And so, guys, don't be intimidated by this preterism It really is nonsense. I'm sorry. There's just there's no nice way to put it. It doesn't work. And Gary DeMar is supposed to be one of their top dogs. And what did we do? We dismantled all of his points. We dismantled his challenge that Antichrist doesn't make any covenants, any leagues. We dismantled his claim. He has a lot of claims and assertions without evidence. And so the one that he made that said, oh, the Antichrist is nowhere to be found. I mean, we proved that the Antichrist is everywhere. And so with that, I'm almost at the 2-hour mark. So we're going to wrap it up there, guys. And so with that, God bless. Please share this around, and I hope this was helpful.